Eithne Fitzgerald has been on sort of both sides of the line. She's seen the difficult calculations that public figures, particularly politicians and policymakers, have to make. It's not as simple as saying, here's the incontrovertible case for change. There are added dimensions that have to be explored and worked through, and you really, as a policy entrepreneur, have to be aware of that. Latterly, she's situated on the research side of the divide and is one of the key producers of really insightful research about how Irish law and policies should change. So I think it's fascinating to hear from somebody who is like being in this no man's land between knowledge work and policy work and very keenly aware of how to get things done. So Eithne, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Ger, and I'm delighted to be here with I think you were very far-seeing in the title of the conference. We heard so much over the last weekend about the whole area of inclusive citizenship, and it must be an inclusive citizenship for people with disabilities. I work for the National Disability Authority as head of policy, and our, I suppose, bread and butter job is about taking research into policy, about advising government and our Minister Kathleen Lynch, and advising the HSE and the other state bodies on disability, drawing on the evidence and our other work, research, standards development and universal design. I suppose we want to see a world where the bus that passes Jamie's door is one that she can get into because it's designed for people, whatever their age, size, ability or disability. So I'm going to talk about the policy process and where research might fit into that, and it's one element in a very crowded agenda. Say something about the kinds of research evidence and the ones that appeal and speak to policymakers. I'm going to give two examples. One is of the new models of services and supports that we're trying to work towards in the disability world, and secondly, talk about closing our institution, and those examples, if you like, of evidence-informed policies, and then say something about next steps. So it's a crowded policy space out there. I know, I've been there. And here are a number of the things. Political values and priorities are there on the agenda, if you like, independent of what the research says. So, for example, next door in our neighbouring island, we see that the Cameron government has taken a policy stance to move away from inclusive education for children with disabilities and back towards segregated education. And that's, if you like, representing policy values. Again, on the neighbouring island, we see that in Scotland and Wales there's much more emphasis on a public way of doing things, where in England the political values are much more emphasised on going the market route. Political priorities, again, shape what happens, whether disability is up there as a high priority or whether there are other things. As we know, the policy space at the moment is dominated by the EU, IMF, ECB, Troika, and the need to get the public finances on track, and it's often very hard to get other things in on that policy agenda. In the looking at, for example, trying to get new rules on accessibility of housing and accessibility of public buildings, the revised Part M, it had to take its place in the queue because it was a priority given to energy efficiency in buildings, and that revision of the building regulations took first. So political priorities again shape what happens in the policy space. The programme for government obviously is a driver for government themselves and a guiding document for the public service and what they're going to put on the agenda, and if it hasn't made it into the programme for government, maybe less likely to be done in a particular 5-year government period. Cost and money is a huge influence on policy, and we all know, again, with the Troika in town, that anything that costs new money isn't going to happen. However, the good news is that on the disability services alone, we're spending 1,500 million, and we know that's a lot of money. It's a lot of money in comparison with other countries, and we know we can get better value for it, and we know it can be better spent. So there's money there that can be recycled. We don't have to always depend on new money. There's the legacy of the current system, and it's often very hard to turn around a ship. And there's a lot of people who, have built their lives around the way things are done at present. So there's interest groups, whether they're service providers, whether there's staff who like their current rosters and how that fits in with their family life. There's families of people with disabilities who maybe are quite comfortable that, Johnny is going to a day service or he's in residential care without maybe looking too closely into, could Johnny get a better life? Service users, again, haven't been in the past maybe as organised a group, but Jamie and people like Martin Naughton have really been putting that the voice of people with disabilities very much to the fore. The affected towns, we've got a great tradition in this country of electing hospital candidates, and what are our institutions? Only former hospitals. So that's going to be a bit of a political battle. We know, for example, in Clonmel there's quite a rearguard action being fought against closing down an old psychiatric hospital that is a completely outdated model of delivery of service. Yet there is a vested interest, if you like, in keeping it there, and they elect political figures who support that. So this stuff isn't going to be easy. The public service, again, the civil service, and I think we can be proud of an independent and professional and competent civil service in most dimensions, again trying to do the right thing. And what the HSE wants to do and what the civil service wants to do is a major influence on public policy, what we call the permanent government, as we know from Sir Humphrey. The issues that the media puts on the agenda and the slant it gives to those issues, again, can frame what's happening. I'm very interested and a bit alarmed at the moment about some of the debate on special needs assistance, because there's nearly an impression that first of all, that there's no special needs assistance in the system, or that every child should have special needs assistance glued to their back, which is the absolute antithesis of moving towards independent living. But again, that's one of the issues, and how those issues are dealt with in the media and how people react to those. And maybe we need a more nuanced look at some of those issues. Standards and regulations. Jamie has talked about the UN Convention and international obligations. For example, if the HICWA standards were implemented in the morning, I think we would have to close our institutions because they simply wouldn't pass those things. And finally, we have research evidence. So it's there competing in a very crowded policy space, but very important that it would be there and it would be treated with integrity. So we look at the kinds of evidence that we have. One of the things we often do, or we read, or we commission people to do reviews of the literature, and I'm really struck how often what is presented as academic literature very often represents people's personal opinions and not the findings of studies. So I think we need to look really, really carefully at that, and where you are getting evidence to see what size was the sample, what was the method used, and so on. So you have somebody presenting something that's based on 2 people, that is not a generalisable, necessarily valid conclusion. So we need to look at the difference between what's theory and opinion on the one hand and what's actually findings of fact on the other. Facts and figures. We're fortunate in this country that we have a lot of kind of now hard evidence in terms of facts and figures. We have the censuses of 2002, 2006, and our new one now coming out 2011. We've got the National Disability Survey. I keep it on my desk and consult it every day. We've Mary McCarran's terrific piece of work looking at the lives of people with intellectual disabilities aged over 40. Again, a hugely rich source of evidence on what the issues are for people and the differences between their lives and the lives of the ordinary lives lived by everybody else in the community. We have the 2 databases. So we have a lot of hard facts and figures, and that's very important. But it's also important that we have qualitative evidence as well, that behind the facts and the figures we, if you like, reach down into the texture of people's lives and what are the whys and what's going on there as well. Studies that look at what works, really, really important in terms of influencing policymakers. And again, that these would be well and rigorously done before and after comparisons, or, the randomised control trial, though it's not always doesn't always replicate, matched comparisons, looking at working models, and we've lots of good working models in Ireland, and looking at working models elsewhere, and we're going to hear later on today from people about what's working and some of the downsides, because we need to know not just the rosy picture but also what to look out for, what are the critical success factors to make things work. And the public service really are interested in seeing, is there a working model? How does it work? And what makes it tick? That's a really, really important kind of evidence. And the outcomes, what are we achieving with particular kinds of things? Really, our evidence must be rooted in the lived experience of people with disabilities. And again, that's a very important part of our work, where we go out and we consult. We have a very good piece of work which is on our website that we did last year, consulting people with disabilities on independent living through a series of 15 focus groups. Very rich material there. We need research that speaks to policy, which is valid, honest, presented in plain English, that understands the policy context both in framing the research questions and in framing recommendations, that the findings inform the conclusions. The conclusions aren't preconceived coming out of the head of the researcher, their own opinion, that is actually their conclusions are informed by the findings of the research, and that the recommendations are focused on solving problems. That's the kind of research that speaks to policy. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Today is the closing date for the consultation on the Disability Policy Review, and some people here in this room, Christy and Martin, worked on the expert reference group that drew up this new model for services. So moving from services to supports, from focusing on inputs to focusing on outcomes, from block grants to service providers towards individualised fundings, replacing institutions with the community, from one size fits all where you have to fit into the model of service that's there, to accommodating the diversity and people's choices. From the service provider deciding the shape to joint decisions being made with the service user at the centre and their family, and the state and the HSE, again, listening to that, and that shaping what we do. And this approach is very much rooted in the evidence. We have an expensive model of service, highly professionalised, segregated, wraparound services, where we're not tapping into the natural community supports. For example, if somebody wants to go to the cinema, instead of, the cinema will be full of other people in that community, in that village, in that town, who are chosen to go to the same film. Why do you need, 2 paid staff to bring somebody to the film instead of tapping into that network of support? We've segregated services where people are collected from their homes and brought off on a bus to a segregated day service and brought back again in the evening. And again, Jamie has said to us very eloquently how people are saying they don't want to be sitting, for the day with 200 other people with disabilities. They want to be part of the regular community. People are being made fit into the model, not the other way around. And here's some data from Mary McCarran's study of people with intellectual disabilities aged over 40. 30% don't choose what they eat every day. 30% don't choose what they watch on TV. 45% have no choice about when they go to bed. And 75% have no choice about where they want to live. Now, is that a life lived as people would choose to live it, or is it a life determined by staff rosters and by the way things are organised? So, are we spending that 1,500 million for the providers and the staff, or are we spending that 1,500 million to deliver a better life for people with disabilities? That's the real core question here. We're not delivering the services that people with disabilities want. They've said in the various consultations they want choice, control, ordinary lives in ordinary places. And we know that individualised services deliver better quality of life. Again, there's been research on the In Control in the UK, and that's very, very clear. And you can see research on our own website that sort of documents this, from studies of international experience, studies of the literature and so on, and our own consultations with people with disabilities. The second example I want to give you is the Congregated Settings Report. It is rooted in Article 19 of the UN Convention, people having a right to live in the community with the choice of where and with whom to live. So this work of the Congregated Settings Group was very much informed by the research, the evidence. The current situation, visits to 40 of the 72 centres, the data collected informed by those site visits. So how can we document the impression, the qualitative impression of what was seen? The research evidence on what gives best outcomes, good practice in other jurisdictions. There are case studies about individuals who successfully moved to the community, and now there are demonstration projects underway in Ireland. So what did that evidence show? That 3/4 of the people have been living in institutions for 15 years or more, so it is their lives. And if we don't close them soon, people will end their lives there. People living physically isolated from the community, from towns, up long driveways, just not engaged with the community, even physically isolated. People with very limited contact with families. That link to the people who love you had been broken. In the last decade, 620 people moved out. We think we're making progress, but actually 700 people moved in. So when you look at the numbers, there's actually 80 people more living in institutions in 2008 than in 1998. A quarter of people live 4 or more to a bedroom, and typically they had 2 to 4 feet between adjoining beds. Is that any way for an adult to spend the last 15 years of their lives? A quarter of people had no day programme. There was a lack of privacy and dignity, and this is a quote from Christie's report: 20 older people with severe disability, 1 accessible shower and 2 wash basins. So people queuing up to get the most basic of basic care. And huge variation in cost per head. So there's lots of money in the system, but not being well deployed. And the international research findings showed there have been 30 years of studies showing the quality of life is better in the community on virtually any measure you want to pick. The research also shows, this is an NDA study, that dispersed housing is better than clusters, because some people have replaced their institutions with another kind of a series of bungalows on the grounds. That isn't the answer either. The people want to live in houses and apartments scattered throughout the community, and that gives a better quality of life. Smaller is better. And if you're going for the group home model, for the people who want to choose that, group homes of 4 or less work better than larger ones. Again, as normal life for people. And people living with only staff support appear to conduct their lives more independently than people who are wrapped around with services all the day. Some people have too much service, but they can't, if you like, blow their nose without somebody else coming over and blowing it for them. And we stifle people's independence. We ensure that they don't learn to cook for themselves, to manage for themselves. And we've had assumptions that people are less competent than they are. And a very interesting project which Pobble funded, the Brothers of Charity, and they moved 40 people out of institutional or group home living into lives of their own choice. And they had a champion who helped them envisage what they were going to do. And in each case, the staff said and the parents said, we had no idea that they could move so far and so fast. And the quality of life was infinitely better for people when they moved. So we do need to imagine that and not wrap and smother people too much. The research findings also show us what to look out for in moving from institutions. Don't let the move become mini institutions. And if you move the same regimes and the staff with the same job descriptions into the community, what you've done is, instead of having one big institution, you might have 10 little institutions in the community. Staff retraining for new roles is vital. It's not a model of service, it's a model of supporting people to maximise their independence. We know that people living in the community, this comes up from Mary's work and from the international research, get fewer health checks. So you really need to proactively look at minding people's health. It's easy to have the company doctor come in when you're all in a big institution and people are put through programmes and regimes. And that often doesn't happen when people are living independently. So you need to watch out for and plan that. And we need to build links into the community. People can be maybe physically located in the community but isolated within it. And one of the things I'm involved in, I'm on the GA Disability Committee and hoping to use that fantastic community network to link people into their communities. And we need to join the dots. We need to ensure that when people are living in the community, that the social welfare and the local authority and the HSE and the VEC and all the different bits and pieces work together to form a coherent package of supports for people. So what are the next steps? We need to keep policy focused on what the evidence shows. Implementing the congregated settings report, as I've said, in the policy space, there's a lot of other voices. And there's a lot of voices who say, 7 years is too fast. They did it in Wales in 3 years. 7 years is not too fast. And the clock starts now. There are voices saying, it's jobs, whatever, it's difficult. I think we need to take on those voices and say the evidence shows that every day that people live in the kind of conditions I've described is one day too long. We need to get moving on this stuff, and we need to ensure that we have a change management process that builds on the leadership that already is out there, and that centres our policy on what is right for people with disabilities, not what's right for the other people in the system. And we need to get on with that task. The consultation on the review of disability services closed today. That's a major systems change. It'll take a lot of work, and again, good change management was going to be vital, and good leadership, and I was delighted to see the leadership shown yesterday by the Federation in bringing that whole notion of individualised services and bringing their membership along with that. That's very important. As an agency, the National Disability Authority is working very hard on the research and on the policy advice to move on what we've already done, what's already in place in terms of that policy reference group, to the next stage. So we're doing research at the moment on resource allocation models. We're going to do a trial on whether the SIS that they use in the States or the in-control model in the UK, which works best in the Irish context, which is easiest, which is cheapest, which is most transparent, which gives the best fit in terms of the money that would come out compared to people's needs. So that project is up and running. We have published a literature review on natural community supports, and we have a further work in the field. That's critical to that new model, that people are linked into their communities. And as we did the research, what's coming out is that we're not looking at merely like natural community supports. The word is really around networks for people, people's own personal networks. And again, that research will be published later on into the new year. We're looking at systems to deliver assistive technology. So we know that has opened up huge possibilities for people. But how do we ensure that the technology gets to people and is geared to their needs? And what's the systems change that we need to do there? We're looking at the assessment of need. I think most people would recognise the assessment of need of under fives has gone, quite off the rails. And we want to ensure that we have a good, crisp way of assessing needs that gets the services to people and the supports to people quickly, rather than where all the resources get tied up in the assessment process and we've no therapists left to deliver services. So we're doing a piece of work on that. We're doing some work on the accessible mainstream health services, again in partnership with the HSE. So these are important pieces of work, and I think it's very important that the direction of policy where we're going now, the new vision we have, that if you like, informs the kind of next pieces of homework that we do. So as we deepen and move into the implementation phase, that again, that is policy that we can drive forward, policy that is actually informed by the evidence, informed by what the research studies show, and informed by what works on the ground and what works in terms of good outcomes for people with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Eithne. That was really a masterclass on the interface between evidence, research and public policy. I think you showed us the complexity of the policy agenda and all of the various factors that go into shaping public policy, including legacy issues, what we're carrying from the past. And it's a very difficult management of change challenge to try and put distance between that and the present, and also the issue of cost, which we can't ignore. But you also made the point, which is very telling, which is that we do currently spend 1.5 billion in this country, which is in the tutelage of the IMF and the European Central Bank. We're still spending 1.5 billion, and there's plenty of room in there, I think, to reorient how we're doing things. You also spoke about research that goes to what works. And that, in a sense, is why we're putting it on today, to look at some other countries to see what works, but also what doesn't work. as a way of trying to inform a more open-ended debate in this country about our future strategies, and also the importance of research that speaks to the policy and the policy challenges the country faces rather than research for its own sake. I'm glad to say the research that's going to be announced this afternoon that we're about to publish does exactly that, I would say. I think the importance of relinking people through our services to the natural supports is really key to inclusive citizenship and advancing a different model of services in this country, services that actually support rather than services that are put in place for their own sake. You mentioned the report on congregated settings, which I think is the single best report produced in this country in the last few years on disability. If you haven't read it, you really should, because it puts a model together actually for the rest of the world and not just for Ireland in how we implement Article 19 on the right to live independently and be included into the community. You also said, and I think it chimes with the whole issue of legal capacity in Article 12 of the Convention, that too many people out there in society, not just service providers, but everybody, have diminished expectations about the capacity of people to assume control over their own lives. And this is one of the attitudinal barriers, I think, that has to be chipped away to create the space that we need. Also, you mentioned the NDA's current research strategy, and I'm very, very heartened to see that it's focused both on natural supports and imaginative ways of connecting people to those natural supports, but also on the question of assistive technologies. Huge, huge, huge potential here. There are also pitfalls. For example, recently there was a research study on the use of technology in the home for older people, and one of the unanticipated results was that the sons and daughters who were living maybe 10 or 15 miles away said, sure, the technology will take care of that. So the visitation rates of the family actually went down as a result of the new technology. But that's just one side of it. There is huge possibilities yet to be further explored.